The true beginning of Danish interaction with the Anglo-Saxons of Great Britain is a bit nebulous, with a few events being described as the first time Danish boots hit British beaches. Generally, the raid on the island monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 off the northeastern coast of Northumbria is considered the event where the Danes first properly showcased the affinity for looting and pillaging that they came to be known for. However, there are some other solid accounts of those classic Danish measures, chiefly a landing on the island of Portland off the southern coast of Wessex around 787 to 789. It's thought they beached to avoid a nearby storm, but whatever their initial intentions were, the interaction with the people of Portland ended in typical Viking fashion, with the ambassador of the local government and his retinue being slaughtered, and the Danes heading back to sea soon afterward. Regardless of when the time of the Danes truly began, it should be clear that the general theme of their visits didn't bode well for the Anglo-Saxons. For decades after Lindisfarne, Danish visits to Great Britain were typically uncoordinated, consisting of pillaging and looting until life had been made sufficiently difficult for the people of the region, such that they forked over money to get the Danes to go away for a while. This payment is usually called a dangeld and was collected as a tax from the local residents. The trend was broken in 865, when, for reasons historians still don't seem quite sure on, the Danes showed up in East Anglia with an army of about 3,000 warriors called the Great Heathen Army by the Anglo-Saxons, and they weren't there for the money. They wanted a lot of land, possibly for farming. They land on the shores of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of East Anglia, but before they can give East Anglia too much of a beating, King Edward figured it was best for his people if he gave the invaders some horses so they could ride straight out of his kingdom and get to conquering the other ones. With their new horses, the Danes wasted no time riding up north to Northumbria, another one of the four remaining kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons, where they claimed the capital York in a surprise attack in 866. The political situation in Northumbria at the time was an interesting one. The current king, Alia, had come to power in 863 after deposing King Osbert. Where it gets weird is that he kept Osbert around, at least in the sense that he didn't kill or exile his major political opponent, a bit of an odd move for the time period. When the Danes took York in 866, Osbert and Alia surprisingly set aside whatever differences they may have had and joined together to bring an army to York and lay siege. It didn't go very well, and they both likely died in battle in 867. But it's interesting that the brutality of the Danes and the threat they posed was enough for a king and a guy he deposed to tolerate each other, at least for a little while. The Danes installed Egbert the First as the new king of Northumbria. Going on a bit of a tangent, albeit a historically relevant one, there's actually a fairly well known Norse legend that coincides with many of the events here. The tale of Ragnar's sons, recently popularized in the history series Vikings, attributes the formation of the great heathen army to the sons of legendary Norse figure Ragnar Lodbrok. To be clear, there's a lot of fact versus fiction going on with Ragnar, with a lot of sources about his life coming from legends written well after his time, but he's generally described as Danish leader, possibly a king, who came to prominence in the early 9th century and got up to a lot of mischief throughout northwestern Europe. Some of his more noteworthy deeds were supposedly leading a fleet throughout the river Seine to besiege Paris in 845, where he failed and died of dysentery. He also may have attempted to settle Dublin in 852, where he died again, killed by rebel Scandinavians. His most well-known death at the hands of Alia of Northumbria, who apparently pushed him into a pit of snakes, is the impetus for the great heathen army. Clearly, though, given the frequency with which he died, there may have been several Ragnar Lodbroks or none at all. Continuing the legend, after Alia killed Ragnar, his sons were none too happy with Northumbria and decided that Alia deserved some classic Viking justice. Ragnar had anywhere from 3 sons to over 8, but the typical roster for the invasion is Halfdan, Ivar the Boneless, Ubba, and Bjorn Ironside. Tracking back to the Siege of York, throughout most Anglo-Saxon sources say Alia died in battle. The Danish legend contends that the brothers Ragnargarson captured and killed him in a much more gruesome manner, one certainly not fit for a king. With Northumbria well on its way to being completely controlled by the Danish, Halfdan decided to stick around in York for a bit to ensure it stayed that way, while the rest of the sons took a couple shots at invading the kingdom of Mercia to the south. They didn't fare too well there and were brought to peaceful terms by King Bergred of Mercia, assisted by the King of Wessex, Ethelred I, and his brother Alfred. Still looking for a fight, and once again wasting no time in finding one, the sons of Ragnar marched into East Anglia once again, this time for more than just the horses. By 870, King Edmund had become Saint Egmund the Martyr, courtesy of Ivar and Ubba, with a solid degree of control over East Anglia. Ivar headed up to Northumbria, while Halfdan returned to lead the army. Ivar is pretty much out of the picture for the rest of this, going up to Dublin and becoming king, only to die a few years later. Keeping up the impressively quick pace, Halfdan led the army down the Thames into Wessex, where they quickly took Reading, pushing his army further into Wessex. And his luck a bit further, Halfdan encountered Elderman Ethelwulf of Berkshire, who delivered a solid loss to the Danes at the Battle of Anglefield, pushing them right on back to Reading. King Ethelred and his younger brother Alfred showed up to lead the siege of Reading. But the success of the Saxons was short-lived, as the Danes not only repelled this siege, but pushed the West Saxons back into nearby marshes, killing Ethelwulf in the battle. The Danes hung around Reading for a little while until the summer of 871, when the aptly titled Great Summer Army arrived, led by Prince Bagseg of Guthrum, a Danish warlord. With these reinforcements, Halfdan and company set out once again to fight some West Saxons, eventually encountering Ethelred and Alfred at the Battle of Ashdown. The Saxons had actually come to this battle quite prepared, having scouted the movements of the Danish troops and cut them off at the Berkshire Downs. They managed to score a decisive victory against the Danes, killing Bagseg in the fighting. Not one to be deterred by significant losses, though, Halfdan continued to wage war against the West Saxons, scoring an important victory at the Battle of Merten, where King Ethelred was mortally wounded, dying shortly after the battle. Due to an agreement between the late king and his youngest brother, Alfred, said youngest brother would become King Alfred, eventually known as Alfred the Great. At the time, though, Alfred was forced to pay the Danish a hefty sum to leave Wessex alone, and the Great Army went back east to London in 872. Halfdan soon led the bulk of the army back to York, where they wintered, with the rest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms either conquered or beaten into submission. The Danes figured it was about time to take another swing at Mercia. In 873, with no support from Wessex, which was still recovering from Halfdan's invasion, the Mercian capital of Repton was quickly captured. By 874, the king of Mercia, Burgred, was exiled from his own kingdom, and his political rival, Ceolwulf, was installed as king. With his success in Mercia, Halfdan decided it was time to take a break and took a contingent of the army back to York to try to consolidate Danish power in the north. His departure left leadership of the Great Army to resident warlord Guthrum, who almost immediately began to lead them back south to try and conquer Wessex.
Guthrum, Alfred, and the Danelaw. Before continuing on to Alfred's interactions with Guthrum, it would be helpful to explore what kind of man and leader Alfred was and would come to be. Alfred was the youngest of 5 brothers, and thus wasn't necessarily in the best position to have a shot at the throne. Though this was still certainly the era of bigger army diplomacy, eldest sons were generally assumed to be the successors to the throne. Alfred's older brother, Ethelred, had succeeded the oldest of brothers, Ethelbert, in 865. Ethelred inherited a kingdom that was about to face years of Danish aggression, and though he struggled against the invaders, Alfred, who had always loved learning and was a rather quick study, was by his brother's side through it all. Given the looming threat of the Danes, Ethelred and Alfred came to the agreement that Alfred should take the throne were something to happen to Ethelred. Alfred had gained military and political experience while with his brother, and after taking the throne, was quick to put it to use. In the years following Halfdan's invasion, Alfred built up a system of burhs, small fortresses that, when needed, would call on the able-bodied men in the area to help fight off the Danes and defend the burh. Speed was the main factor with burhs, as the Danes fought with a quickness and aggression that was difficult to defend against by gathering and marching an entire army out to meet them. A problem the burhs faced, though, was a lack of training and discipline that a significant amount of the locals had, and Alfred could only count on their support in sieges for so long before they returned home. Bringing it back to Guthrum, he managed to march his army well into Wessex, drawing little attention with the help of skilled scouts and Alfred's lack of preparation due to his defeat of Halfdan a few years earlier. Guthrum landed his first major win in 876, taking Wareham, a settlement on the southern coast of Wessex. It's thought that he sheltered at Wareham for quite some time, weathering a siege from Alfred while presumably waiting for reinforcements from his homeland to show up on the shore and help him finish off Wessex. The reinforcements were no-shows, and after a nearly year-long siege, Guthrum was running out of food, and Alfred was running out of men willing to stick around and fight. These conditions forced both leaders, begrudgingly, to come to terms, the terms being that Alfred, once again, paid the Danes to leave and never come back. With payment in hand, Guthrum took his army further west, deeper into Wessex, to the coastal settlement of Exeter. This seems to, at least geographically speaking, go against the point of the deal, which was for Guthrum to, essentially, leave Wessex. It can therefore be assumed that Guthrum had no intention of honoring the agreement, and simply took the money, went on to capture another fort, and wait for more reinforcements. Back up in York, Halfdan removed the reigning puppet king and established himself as monarch, formally establishing Northumbria as a Danish kingdom. Guthrum continued to wait for his reinforcements in Exeter through a good portion of 877, and they still didn't show. Once again running low on supplies, Guthrum again agreed to negotiate, this time with significantly less leverage. He was forced to retreat north into Danish lands and took a break from warring with Alfred. It was also around this time that King Halfdan, feeling he had adequately consolidated his power in York, went to Dublin, likely to try and claim the throne his brother Ivar had lost. He wasn't successful and died in Dublin around 883, leaving York without an active king for several years until Guthrum claimed the throne around the time of Halfdan's death. To the north of York, Eadulf of Bamberg claimed to be the king of Bernicia, a region encompassing southern Scotland and the far north of England. He allied with Alfred. Towards the end of 877, around Christmas time, King Alfred had gathered a significant portion of the nobility of Wessex at Chippenham to feast and celebrate, as well as gain political favor in light of his struggles with the Danes. This didn't turn out particularly well for him, though, as his old buddy Guthrum had decided he'd rather not stay up north and live peacefully, instead delivering a surprise attack to Chippenham during one of the nights of feasting. It all went according to plan, until Guthrum and his men noticed that Alfred wasn't among the dead or captured. Alfred had managed to flee into the nearby Somerset marshes with a handful of men, setting up a base of operations in Athley. Throughout 878, Alfred led a guerrilla campaign against Guthrum and his Danes as they tried to consolidate Danish power in Wessex. Alfred was quite effective at making it difficult for Guthrum to gain a solid foothold, killing nobles that supported him and raiding settlements throughout the region. By May of 878, Alfred had raised enough men to openly confront Guthrum, and the armies met at the Battle of Edington. With their kingdom on the line, Alfred and his men won a decisive victory against Guthrum, sending them back to Chippenham, where, after a short siege, Guthrum was truly defeated. Low on food, men, and morale, Guthrum met with Alfred for negotiations once more, and accepted all of Alfred's terms. The Treaty of Wedmore stipulated that Guthrum would immediately remove himself and his men from Wessex, and that Guthrum would allow himself to be baptized, with Alfred being his godfather. Baptized by Alfred, Guthrum was given the Christian name Ethelstan. Guthrum returned to East Anglia, where he would be king, minting currency printed with his Christian name. Under this new peace between Wessex and East Anglia, Alfred and Guthrum signed another treaty, now known as, fittingly, the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, in the early 880s. This treaty established the borders of the Danish lands to be east of a line drawn between Chester in the north and London in the south, as well as trade between the Danes and people of Wessex, creating the region known as the Danelaw. The Danelaw itself was a fairly straightforward agreement, simply outlining the borders within which the Danes and their laws held jurisdiction, encompassing all of East Anglia and the eastern portion of Mercia. The importance of the Danelaw is the massive effect it had on the people and culture of Great Britain at the time. It is important to remember that just 25 years before the Danelaw was established, there was nearly no permanent Danish presence in Anglo-Saxon lands. Not even a generation had passed by the time the Danes held a large portion of land that was still settled by a largely Anglo-Saxon population. With a Danish ruling class, led by a recently Christian King Guthrum, and a majority of Anglo-Saxons in the working class, the political situation was clearly not very stable. But this created the perfect environment for massive amounts of cultural diffusion. As Danish and English people traded, farmed, and even intermarried, their languages quickly mixed together, with many Danish words and even grammatical concepts finding their way into the quickly changing Old English language. With the much less prevalent Danish presence in Wessex and western Mercia, this also created geographical divides for dialects throughout Great Britain. Within the Danelaw, the 5 main boroughs emerged as the major fortified settlements. Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham, and Stamford were these boroughs, and they served as the focal points of military and political power in what was once eastern Mercia. The Danelaw also separated Guthrum and his people from the rest of the Danes. They were now, perhaps, a bit begrudgingly, allies of the Anglo-Saxon. This was an amazing deal for Alfred, as he gained not only years of relative peace, but an ally and trading partner. Mercia had fallen from being an equal to Wessex years before, and he had now a friendly kingdom next door that was on at least relatively equal footing. Alfred truly became great during this peacetime, expanding his army and navy, fortifying the burghs and fortresses throughout Wessex, and encouraging his people to learn to read and write after years of war. What made Alfred's accomplishments even more impressive was that he was often ill, an apparently painful illness at that.
All good things must come to an end, and this cultural exchange only lasted in earnest until the beginning of the 10th century. In 890, Guthrum died, succeeded by Eoric. Eoric managed a relatively peaceful rule of the Danelaw, though ironically, the peacetime prosperity of the region, along with its tentative peace with the Anglo-Saxons, made it a ripe target for the other Viking invaders. Things became difficult in 899 when the death of Alfred led to his eldest son, Edward, and the son of Ethelred, Ethelwold, to fight for control for the throne of Wessex. Due to his lesser claim to the throne, Ethelwold was unsuccessful in garnering enough support to openly confront Edward, opting to instead flee to Danish York. The people of York, in part due to the partial power vacuum left by Halfdan, accept Ethelwold as their leader in about 901, and he amassed a small army there, sailing to East Anglia in 902 to enlist the help of yet more Danes to fight his brother, who had established a relatively solid claim to the throne. It's possible that Ethelwold was also accepted as king of the Danelaw, but it would be a very short rule. With a sufficient number of soldiers backing him, Ethelwold marched his army west, towards America, which was technically still independent of both the Danelaw and Wessex, but was allied with and essentially a subkingdom to Wessex. This had been cemented a few years earlier when Ethelred II, the king of America, had married Alfred the Great's daughter Ethelfled. The brothers finally met on the battlefield in earnest at the Battle of the Holm in western East Anglia. It was a tough battle for both sides, but in the end both Eoric and Ethelwold were dead, and Edward wasn't, thus resolving the conflict. With Eoric dead, Guthrum II took the throne of the Danelaw. Unfortunately for him, the now firmly established King Edward was not even close to done with the Danes. Utilizing and expanding on the networks of burhs and roads that Alfred had developed during his later years, Edward not only strengthened the defenses of his own kingdom, but used this system to effectively consolidate his powers in the regions of Danish England that he conquered. He began his campaign against the East Anglians by establishing burhs on the border near London in about 912, further developing his position until Jarl Thurkettle, the ruler of Bedford, submitted to Edward around 915, giving the king a much better launch point for his push into East Anglia. Edward and his army arrive in Bedford in 916, soon facing an offensive from Danish forces attempting to halt any further progress and possibly recover Bedford. This offensive was rebuffed relatively easily, with Edward pushing further and further into East Anglia over the following couple years, eventually killing Guthrum II and securing domination over East Anglia. It was also around this time that the ruler of America, Lady Ethelfled, died. She had, by all accounts, been a skilled military leader in her 7 years of rule, carrying out repeated attacks against Danish to the north. Her daughter, Elfwin, succeeded her, but just a month or so after taking the throne, Elfwin was peacefully disposed by Edward, who officially claimed America as part of the rapidly expanding kingdom of Wessex. In York, around 916 to 918, a Dane named Ragnald had come to claim the throne. He was called a grandson of Ivar the Boneless, and was most likely a close relative of Guthrith. Ragnald's familial relation to Ivar may be debatable, but he was certainly similar to Ivar in spirit. Soon after taking the throne of York, Ragnald waged a series of wars against the Scots and Irish to the north. He was fairly successful and conquered, essentially, the whole of northern England after taking Bernicia from the ruling Anglo-Saxons within a couple years of when he claimed the throne. In 921, presumably to try and maintain a semblance of independence, Ragnald acknowledged Edward as an overlord of York. Ragnald died soon after his acknowledgement of Edward, succeeded by Sigtryg, a former king of the Vikings in Dublin. In 926, Sigtryg married the sister of King Ethelstan of Wessex, son of Edward. Edward had died in 924, leaving the throne to Ethelstan. Sigtryg's marriage was almost entirely political, a successful, although short, attempt to further strengthen his claim to York as an independent kingdom. He suddenly died a year later, succeeded by Gurthrith, who has an annoyingly similar name to Gurthfrith. Gurthrith had come from Dublin, and shortly after his arrival in York, was ousted by Ethelstan and had to retreat to Dublin once again. Ethelstan now held the Kingdom of York, marking the first time the whole of England was ruled by a single monarch. Ethelstan was able to keep York peacefully for a while until 937, when a coalition force of northern Scots, Celts from Strathclyde, and Vikings from Dublin under the command of King Olaf Gurthfrithson came looking for a fight, with Olaf specifically claiming the throne of York to be his right. Ethelstan met the coalition force in the Battle of Bernanber and was able to defeat the attackers, though both sides supposedly suffered massive casualties. Ethelstan died in 939, succeeded by Edmund the Magnificent. Edmund quickly lost control of York to King Olaf, who had a rather quick and tumultuous reign, having to almost constantly defend his holdings from the English as well as the Danish in the region. Olaf died in 941, and it's at this point that the power struggle in York got truly ridiculous. To summarize, Olaf II Kieran took the throne, was driven out and back to Dublin by King Edmund in 943, and was quickly replaced by his rival, Ragnar II Gurthrythson. Ragnar was killed just a year later, and Edmund was once again able to claim York and unite England. Edmund died in 946, succeeded by his younger brother Edred. Soon after becoming king, Edred received oaths of loyalty from the lords of Northumbria, but said lords decided to complicate the whole York situation once more, and selected Eric Bloodaxe, a man with a solid yet rather odd resume, to be the king of an independent York. Eric Bloodaxe was a Scandinavian of the Norwegian royal line, having ruled western Norway for a bit before being ousted in the favor of his brother, Hakon, who was supported by none other than King Athelred. In the typical fashion of those in a position of power at that time, Eric had killed most of his brothers to gain a more favorable claim to the throne of Norway, possibly gaining his surname from the several killings required to accomplish the task. After losing the throne, Eric roamed around the British Isles for a while, doing business typical of a ruthless Scandinavian leader. This was until 947, when he was invited to rule an independent kingdom of York. As to be expected, King Edred wasn't a fan of losing York, and was quick to march an army north, a tactic that successfully frightened the Northumbrian nobility into ousting Eric in 948. Edred got another 3 years of having York under his authority until, in 951, the people of York revolted once more, this time inviting Olaf II Kieran back to give it another try. Olaf accepted, and managed to last a year before being ousted by his own people. In a move that shouldn't surprise anyone at this point, the people of York once again invited Eric Bloodaxe back, and he, once again, accepted. This time around, Eric got in 2 years of rule before once again being exiled. He was killed soon after his exile, and Edred, finally, was Edred, King of England. With the death of Eric Bloodaxe, the last Danish ruler in England had died, bringing an end to nearly 100 years of Danish influence on the region. Though the Danish rulers may have been gone, the Danish residents of the region, along with their language and customs, stuck around for much longer. What also remained was the impact of this exceedingly violent period had on England, its rulers, and its people. Dozens of places of worship and knowledge were pillaged and destroyed. Thousands of farmers, merchants, scholars, and nobles died. However, all of this turmoil and suffering did, in the end, create a stronger England. What began with Alfred's guerrilla warfare in the Somerset marshes grew into a massive network of burhs, fortresses, and roads. Local peasant militias became armies, and a divided England became whole.